Well, good morning. I'm kind of looking around thinking, where are my own kids? We leave early at my house, so if their alarms don't go off. I don't think they're shoveling snow. No, when I left, they were not shoveling snow. There are notes to this new subject we've started last week, and they're back. Well, I guess David has those. So we've started a lesson called Origins, Creation by Design, or Cosmic Accident. And last week we went through the first section, the three options for explaining the world's existence. And those three, again, the world is self-created, which we demonstrated is a logical contradiction. The world would have to exist and not exist at the same time and in the same relationship. If that's confusing to you, there's a reason for that, because it is a contradiction. Then we talked about how the world is self-existent and eternal, and the problem with that is that matter doesn't seem to demonstrate that ability. And we listened to that video from Stephen Meyer. Remember that? The universe has a beginning, where he talks about the Big Bang. And then the third option, the world is created by someone who is self-existent and eternal. And we spent quite a bit of time just looking at a variety of biblical passages and just talking our way through those passages. So we're going to continue with that discussion today. But before we do that, I'm going to take just a few minutes to comment on one story that we've been following in the news. And I actually have two videos today, one related to this subject and one related. I've got another Stephen Meyer video that I'll show at some point today. But I wanted to give an update on the University of Pennsylvania transgender swimmer that we talked about. Was it last week? We've talked about this a couple of times, I think. But I've got a video I want to show you, and I think the story is about you might have heard about this, about a swimming official who's resigned over this situation. And I thought that the interview of her was interesting, and I thought it was just worth showing you all today. So let me pull that up. And but you're familiar with this story? Or are you familiar with this? The male, biological male, who's crushing all the swimming records at Division I college level, and the university is supportive of him. The NCAA continues to be supportive of him. I'm referring to him as a him. Why would I not? I mean, I listened to an interview here recently on this story, and the person doing the talking was very much opposed to this individual swimming with the women. And yet the person referred to the individual as a biological male. But then in the rest of the interview, or the rest of the story, referred to him as a her. And I thought I wanted to sort of scream at the television, because you're undermining your argument when you do that. I mean, the whole point here is that he should not be allowed to swim with the women because he is a male. And the person was arguing that while referring to him as a her, because the person has been influenced by transgender ideology and wanting to, I think, be kind and civil. But what the person was doing was lying every time she referred to this biological male as a her. Now, I realize you might find yourself in a work environment where you could get in a lot of trouble if you don't use the pronoun that the person desires you to use. And so your situation might be a lot more complicated than mine. I don't have those restrictions or limitations. I've decided, as I've thought about this, as I've heard the argument, you use the pronoun of the person's choice because that's just being polite. But you know what that also is? It's telling lies. And the book by Rod Dreher that I read last year, Don't Live by Lies, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, his famous statement, don't live by lies. If we use those pronouns, we are living by lies. We are. So I have the freedom to speak truth in a way that perhaps others are more restricted. So I'm going to try to do my best to never use pronouns in ways that violate biological sex and biological reality. And to the extent that you can do that also, I would encourage you to do that. But I do realize that some of you could be in situations where anybody here could you get fired for doing that? Yeah. So, I mean, that's a tough situation you find yourself in, okay?
Cynthia Millen has spent 3 decades as a U.S. swimming official, but she has just resigned in protest over transgender swimmer Leah Thomas of the University of Pennsylvania, who is a biological male that has been allowed to compete against females. Thomas is now dominating swimming events and setting records. In her resignation letter, Millen simply said she, quote, can't support this, and that, quote, everything fair about swimming is being destroyed. Cynthia Millen joins me now. Cynthia, listen, thank you for joining me on the show, and thank you for your bravery. I guess I'm just curious, what kind of response have you gotten since you resigned from your position?
Sean, thanks very much. I've gotten a lot of kind comments from fellow officials, former officials, and from parents of swimmers and swimmers. The fact is that swimming is a sport in which bodies compete against bodies. Identities do not compete against identities. And from the very beginning, when you start out as an age grouper, swimmers are divided by sex and by age group, 8 and under, 9, 10, etc., all the way up, because from the very beginning, swimming, USA Swimming recognizes that boys swim differently from girls. And this is just accentuated when boys and girls go through puberty. Boys will always have larger lung capacity, larger hearts, greater circulation, a bigger skeleton, and less fat. Girls go through puberty and they have a double whammy. They not only grow breasts and hips, but they have periods, and they often have a totally different center of gravity. They have to learn how to swim over again. So while Leah Thomas is a child of God, he is a biological male who is competing against women, and no matter how much testosterone suppression drugs he takes, he will always be a biological male and have this advantage. And it's horrible. The statement for women then is, you don't matter, what you do is not important, and little girls are going to be thrown under the bus by all of this. He's going to be destroying women's swimming.
Cynthia, so true. And I guess my next question for you is, young women who push back against, biological males competing in their sport, they can be bullied. The social media blowback can be great. But you look to, moms across America, moms of athletes, or you look to pro athletes or Olympic athletes who competed in these sports as women to stand up for girls today to compete against other women. Are you seeing that kind of mother support or other kind of athletes in the Olympics that stand up and support this movement to say biological girls should compete against biological girls and biological boys should compete against biological boys?
Well, it's great, Sean. I'm getting great letters from dads of daughters and also moms of daughters, but we're also seeing some past Olympians stepping up and saying, no, this is wrong. We must remember that our Olympic swimming for women was built on great swimmers like Jill Turkle, Shirley Babashoff, Janet Evans, Jenny Thompson, all of these women who worked so hard before Title IX when they didn't have the opportunities that men had. And it would be such a shame, it would be such a travesty to throw it all away now. And this is what will happen. We must face facts. Men are different from women. Men swimmers are different from women, and they will always be faster than women.
Cynthia, as a father of 6 girls, I have 9 kids, 6 are girls. Thank you for standing up for girls to actually have the ability to compete and win when they compete against other girls. And I hope that every mother out there, every father out there, every Olympic swimmer or any women athlete stands up and stands with you to say this is wrong and it's unfair. And thank you for lending your voice to this cause and standing up and resigning in protest. You're a great American.
Thank you very much, Sean.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox.
Okay. I have an article. I just thought this was interesting. This is from GLAAD, which of course is a pro-LGBTQ plus organization. And this is a tweet. I think it's a tweet. Yes, it's a tweet. There's that little bird in the corner. I don't do tweeting and I don't do any of this stuff. But it says, congratulations to trans college swimmer Leah Thomas on setting 2 conference records. We long to see this level of trans excellence, especially in sports, where it's been a profoundly difficult year for trans and non-binary people. Congratulations, Leah Thomas, on your historic achievements. So that's the other side of this, speaking last week. And obviously what they're saying is we're not backing down. And we're congratulating this biological male as he crushes biological females in the swimming pool. And they're celebrating this. In that clip that I showed you, the thing that stood out to me, there are 2 things really. One is moms and dads standing up, which I think is hugely important. And the other was, I can't remember the word she used at the beginning, where she's talking that sports is not about ideology, it's about your body, and the physical differences between the male body and the female body. So anyway, that continues to be in the news, and it continues to be something that I'm talking about it again today because, quite frankly, it just vexes me. I find myself so frustrated over this story in particular because it just is so contrary to fact. It's so contrary to science. It's so contrary to truth. It's so radically untruthful. And it's one of those stories that, I can't wrap my mind around it, and I can't make sense of it. It's like 2 + 2 = 5. And it doesn't equal 5, does it? And I suspect that the vast majority of people, even those who are kind of capitulating to this, know that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5. And hopefully at some point, sanity will prevail on this issue. We can certainly pray to that end. Okay? Then returning then to our notes. You all have the notes? So last week we looked at what I'm calling a classical approach. And I'm deriving this language, classical, then you see in the notes a presuppositional approach. I'm deriving that from the study of apologetics. Apologetics is that discipline of defending the faith. That's what the word basically means. And there are 2 approaches to apologetics. One of them is called classical apologetics, where you make traditional arguments for the existence of God. The other approach is called presuppositional apologetics, and they are quite different. And in the Christian world, people are divided into these 2 camps. Either I believe in classical apologetics or I believe in presuppositional apologetics. I think there's some value to both of these, and so I don't know that I want to have to choose one over the other. But today we're going to talk about more the presuppositional approach. And somebody just asked the question, what is a presupposition? Can you define that word? We need to be able to define that word. We all need to understand for this to make sense. What is a presupposition? Okay. Yeah, the prefix pre means before. So the idea of a presupposition, it's something where I will gratuitously, that's another big word, grant the validity of a proposition. In other words, I'm not forced to prove it. So I can grant a certain truth. So one presupposition would be the God of the Bible exists. Okay? That's where the Bible starts, doesn't it? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Bible doesn't start with a detailed, logical argument for the existence of God. It just asserts that he exists. And so, again, a presupposition is I'm making an assertion that the God of the Bible exists. And it's valid to do that because everybody does it. Okay? The atheist does it too. What's the presupposition for atheism? There is no God. Or the God of the Bible does not exist. Can the atheist prove that? No. He assumes it. Okay? So much of what we actually do believe starts with certain presuppositions that we don't prove, we believe, and we state them. Now, where I find the value of this kind of approach is that you can then begin to explore what are the consequences of this presupposition? Or what are the consequences of denying this presupposition? And so it leads you down the road of asking these kinds of questions. Which worldview makes the most sense of the world in which we live? So again, if you're an atheist, if that's your starting point, if that's your fundamental presupposition, that's the basement level, that's the foundation of your worldview, there is no God, what are the consequences of asserting that, of presupposing that, of living out of that? Because ideas all have consequences, don't they? And so this is a more indirect approach, but it's trying to get at the issue of we have to live in this world. This is a real world. We live in it. How do we make sense of it? And which of those two presuppositions allows us to live in this world in a really coherent, unified kind of way? Does that make sense, what I'm getting at? Yes, no, maybe? Doesn't make sense? Well, hopefully, if it's a little confusing to you, it'll make more sense as we look at some of these presuppositions for both of these worldviews. So presupposition number one, the God of the Bible exists. Well, what does that mean? I mean, realistically speaking, how does that play out in terms of how we live our lives? And so there's some fill-ins here, and there might be more than just four. I just listed the four what seemed to me the most obvious ones. The world is created with purpose. Okay? That would be the first fill-in. That is a logical consequence, it seems to me, of affirming that the God of the Bible exists. Okay? Now, you could have other approaches, too. You could say God in general exists, right? You could take the word Bible out of this. But I'm making this is my presupposition. This is my starting point. The God of the Bible exists. Okay? So I'm starting from a Christian starting point. And that means if the God of the Bible exists, that means that the world is created with purpose. Does that make sense? Okay, why does that make sense? Talk back to me. Why does that make sense? Why would it be true that if the God of the Bible exists, the world is created with purpose? And I'm not looking for something profound here. I think it's pretty obvious. Okay? Brings about order. Yeah, I mean, do we create things that have no purpose? Well, but I mean, I did think of handcrafts and so forth, but even still, Maria yesterday, she showed me this little bunny she knitted. And I mean, I will admit that it is harder for me to see a purpose in that particular item. But it has a purpose for her. Why did you do that? What drove you to do that? There's got to be a purpose. You did that for a reason.
You want the reason?
Yeah, I'm asking.
I enjoy making it.
Yes.
And I enjoy feeling it, using up scraps.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me smile.
So as the creator, you created that with purpose for your enjoyment. Okay? Could we extrapolate that and say that one of the reasons that God created is for his enjoyment? That he actually takes satisfaction in what he makes. Okay? I mean, that makes sense to me. By the way, Maria's got a knitting wheel now, a spinning wheel. And so I joke with her, and she's got rabbits that she can shear, to turn into yarn. And so I joke with her that if the whole world really goes to pot and everything fails us, we will at least have some clothing. Because Maria can make clothing now. What? Well, yes, you're right, but I don't know. We could get creative and shave our kids. Hobbs' hair actually can sort of be knitted. Yes, Dick. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, well, the second one of these is related to the first. The world is created with purpose, and I mean, to me, in my mind, I think, well, that means that I am created with a purpose, aren't I? And so I start to ask the question, well, what might that purpose be? And of course, the Bible would give me a lot of answers to that question, and we could explore that at some length. What's the Westminster Confession say? Remember that, the first question in the Shorter Catechism? What is the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy him forever. And it's not one of those, it's both of those. And it's important that we remember it's both of those. So the confession is saying that my created purpose is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. I do really like what Piper does with that statement. He helps put them together better. What is the purpose of man? To glorify God by enjoying him forever. Do you see what he's getting at? The best way we glorify God is by enjoying him. And you can make all kinds of analogies, which I have in the past, that are really feeble analogies, but if you go to Dairy Queen and you sit down and you're really enjoying that Blizzard or that Peanut Buster Parfait, you might say, this is really good. So actually praising what you're enjoying enhances your enjoyment of it. And so food is a fairly good example for this. But we are created, according to the confession, I think is a biblical response, to glorify God, and we do that by enjoying him, and we enjoy him forever. So that means that we're created in a sense for God, but God's also given himself to us. He's created us in such a way that we find our greatest joy in him. Okay? Here's a third truth that would flow out of this presupposition of the God of the Bible exists, where there is a creator, a sovereign intelligence who's responsible for all of this. Number 3, there is objective truth, including right and wrong. Now again, I'm not asking you to respond to this because I'm afraid you don't get it. I'm sure you do get it. But why is it the case that if there is a God, a sovereign God, a relational God, why does that mean that there is objective truth in this world? And you know what I mean by objective truth? I mean true truth. I mean, certain things are right and certain things are wrong in an objective, unchanging way. Okay, we live in a world where that notion is kind of largely dismissed until someone steals from you, and then it becomes pretty clear and pretty objective that it's pretty wrong, right? When they break into the store and steal stuff from other people, we're not so certain what to do with that. But when they steal from your house, then all of a sudden people become more clear in terms of their moral convictions. But so why is it that if there's a God, there's objective truth? How do we put those two together? Mm-hmm.
It takes the burden of truth off of us, and what I see, what I think, and puts it on something above us, so we don't need to change that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it, it's the whole idea that there's an authority that is beyond us and above us. There's a transcendent authority, God. And if you remove that, then you've basically got Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler both claiming to be doing the right thing. I need to turn this down, don't I? Well, it's ringing a little bit. I turned it up for the video. Do you understand what I'm saying there? I mean, who is to say that Hitler was wrong? We pretty much all say that Hitler's wrong. I mean, there are some folks out there that are so anti-Semitic that they deny the Holocaust and venerate Hitler and so forth. But, we have a word for those folks. They're deranged, delusional, and crazy, right? Those are 3 words. We say Hitler's wrong, but on what basis do we say that? Because there's a lawgiver in heaven who gives the 10 commandments, and one of those commandments is thou shalt not murder. That's how we know that it's wrong. But if you remove that, it's very difficult, really, to say that this individual's wrong and some individual's right. Because guess what? It's just your word against mine. And who are we? I mean, who am I to tell you that you're wrong or you to tell me that I'm wrong? Because you know what? You're just a really small, insignificant little worm of a person. I mean, if you take God out of the picture, that's where this starts to go. Okay? So, can you live in that kind of a world? Can you live in a world where there's not purpose, where there's not meaning, where there's no objective truth? And I would say that there's a lot of folks in our culture today who are trying to live in that world, and they're not living very well.
I think that's where all of the anxiety and depression and mental illness comes from, is because they don't have this center of gravity, and so everything's coming at them and it just overwhelms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that brings in a whole different set of statements we could make, which are worth making, and that would be something like this. If the God of the Bible exists, I don't have to be destroyed by fear or anxiety or all of those things that are real, aren't they? I mean, now that I'm in my 50s, cancer seems a lot more real than it did when I was in my teens, right? And so we realize our mortality, we realize there's so much in this life that can take us out. And yet, if you believe that you're in the hands of a sovereign God, and the God of the Bible is a sovereign God, then that does allow for a level of peace to come into your life because you realize you're not in the hands of, what's the alternative? Fate, right? Or nothing, right? So there is something called objective truth, what Francis Schaeffer referred to as true truth. And then the 4th one I had here is, well, it kind of gets to this, I guess. Suffering is transformative, okay? one of the things that if you're talking to secular people and they want to throw, here's a joke. What is red and hazardous to your teeth? What is red and bad for your teeth? I'm not sure what difference it makes, but we'll say it her way. What is red and bad for your teeth? No, a brick. Okay? So, when secular people want to throw a brick at you as a Christian, one of the things that they will very often bring up is the whole issue of suffering. Have you heard this before? You know, it goes something like this: if God is good and if God is sovereign, then how do we explain there's so much suffering in this world? Yeah, how can a good God and a sovereign God allow so much suffering? And of course, we do feel the weight of that. And I'm not going to, that's something that we can address. I'm not going to address that in detail today because that goes in a direction that we don't need to go today. What I want to do, though, is just simply point out to you that issue cuts both ways. In other words, if I do wake up at some point and I don't feel good and I go to a doctor and the doctor says you have cancer and it's a really bad cancer, as a Christian, I'll tell you how I know I am to process that. I'm to process that as there is mystery in this world. There are many things I do not understand, but I believe that God is good, and I believe that I am in God's hands, and I believe that God has a purpose beyond this life, and I believe in something called glory, and I believe when I die that I'm going there, and I believe that my cancer will be stripped out of me, and someday I'll have all my hair again, and I'll be physically fit without exercising. I have this hope that's all rooted in my Christian view that allows me to face something like cancer and also to recognize that much suffering in this world is transformative. The Bible teaches that, right? That God has a purpose in our suffering, even when we don't understand all of what that purpose is. We have the confidence that comes from knowing it's not meaningless. Now, see, that's where you feel the weight of the atheist who's throwing that brick at you, because the atheist also gets cancer. Cancer doesn't care whether you believe in God or not, does it? Cancer is an equal opportunity disease. And when the atheist gets cancer, what does he or she have to stand upon? Nothing. Okay? So when you suffer, do you want to suffer knowing that you're in the hands of God, or do you want to suffer knowing that there's no purpose, there's no meaning, there's nothing? Okay? So actually, it seems to me in a lot of ways, Christians have a lot more ammunition for this issue of suffering than our opponents do. But what happens is that the opponent throws the brick at you and you don't know what to say, and so it's easy to just sort of acquiesce under that. But it's important to kind of push back and say, what's your answer to suffering? Okay? Any thoughts on that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Stonewall Jackson seems to have been a committed Christian, even though he fought for a government who supported slavery, right? So there you see the inconsistencies. Yeah. I guess it's the same statement as there's no atheists in foxholes, in a sense, right? Yeah. Well, okay, let's take this then, and proposition number 2, I mean, we can do this very quickly because I think you can see where this is all going. There is no God. So now you're assuming the opposite presupposition. Again, you're not proving this. You're just basing your beliefs, your values, your convictions, your worldview on this unproven assumption. That's a good way to think of a presupposition. A presupposition is an unproven assumption. Okay? And we do this all the time. Scientists do this, theologians do this, everybody does this. So the unproven assumption now is there is no God. Well, where does that lead you? First of all, the world is a cosmic accident, right? It's just an accident. Number 2, then, I have no purpose because I'm a cosmic accident. Number 3, there is no foundation for ethics, or there's no foundation for right and wrong. I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a Supreme Court justice 100 years ago or so, reflects upon this. He was an atheist or an agnostic, or both. I mean, you can't really be both, right? An atheist says there is no God. An agnostic says, I don't know if there's a God because God hasn't spoken clearly enough for me to know whether he exists. Which one of those is worse? I almost think agnosticism is worse because it more consciously blames God for my ignorance. Whereas the Bible in Romans 1 says we're without excuse. We all know God exists, okay, because God has written that knowledge into our hearts. But he was on that side of this whole spectrum, and Oliver Holmes was asked the question, well, what about right and wrong? What about all these issues that we're talking about right now? And he said, you know, when my mind goes to these places, he said, I just stop thinking. I go downstairs and I play pinochle. Okay? Now, here's a little suggestion for you. If you have a worldview that causes you to think less rather than more, there might just be something deficient with your worldview. Okay? Because that's what he was saying. I mean, when I'm faced with these issues, I just stop thinking. I don't want to think about these things. That's Carl Sagan too, right? If you push Carl Sagan and said, well, Carl, what caused the Big Bang, or what was before the Big Bang? He'd say, I don't want to go there. I'm just going to stop thinking now. Okay? But we can't live that way, can we? We need to know. Okay? So the world is a cosmic accident. I have no purpose. There is no foundation for ethics. And then finally, suffering is meaningless, right? It really is meaningless. And then what Clara was saying, you know, how do you deal with anxiety? How do you find peace in this life and so forth? And I think this is right. And we have a national epidemic of teenage suicide. And I do suspect that part of the explanation for that, maybe the lion's share of the explanation, is wrapped up in these issues right here. Because we can't live without purpose and meaning. And yet our culture is telling us there is no purpose and there is no meaning. And so people are trying to find purpose and meaning, but it's like they find themselves 10 feet up in the air. You know, the foundation's been pulled out from underneath them. Because that foundation is the Christian worldview. And we're actively destroying that worldview in our culture. All right? So I'm going to stop here and let us listen to Stephen Myers. Dan asked his educational background. So he has a PhD from Cambridge, and his PhD work was done on the philosophy of science. The philosophy of the history of science. Yes, there you go. So he's an expert on, that gets you into all sorts of issues, I would think. He's a very smart man. Let's see if I'm smart enough to get him up here. We're not going to donate today. I guess I want to push this one. And let me turn this up just a little bit and then I'll start this. This again, I think this is a 6 or 7 minute video. It's not a long video. But he gets into some of the issues that we've been talking about, and that's why I think it's worth, it's 5 minutes and 48 seconds.
In a recent interview, while I was presenting some scientific discoveries that may point to the existence of God, a camera operator, a young woman whom I'll call Maria, began to weep visibly. Later, she told me the reason for her tears. Like many young people, Maria believed in God when she arrived in college. But while there, she repeatedly encountered professors who insisted that based on the science, God was a myth, no more real than Santa Claus. Maria didn't feel equipped to challenge her professors. She eventually left college with nagging doubts about her faith and wondered whether life, including her own life, might be nothing more than a cosmic accident. Many young people share Maria's doubts. Indeed, powerful voices in the academy tell us that science makes belief in God and human significance untenable. Or as Richard Dawkins, the famed atheist from Oxford, has asserted, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. But are we the product of such indifference? That is, purely materialistic processes that did not have us in mind, as another scientific atheist has put it? Does the universe have the properties we should expect if this all there is matter vision of reality is correct? Perhaps not. 3 major scientific discoveries contradict the expectations of scientific atheists and point instead in a distinctly God-friendly direction. First, the Big Bang. Discoveries in observational astronomy and developments in theoretical physics have revealed that the universe had a beginning. This is contrary to the expectation of scientific materialists who long portrayed the universe as eternal and self-existent, and therefore in no need of an external creator. This evidence for a beginning has instead confirmed the expectation of theists. Nobel laureate Arno Penzias helped make a key discovery establishing a cosmic beginning. He later observed, "The best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted, had I nothing to go on but the first 5 books of Moses and the Bible as a whole." And he's not alone. Cosmological evidence has led other prominent scientists, including former MIT physicist Gerald Schroeder and the great Caltech astronomer Alan Sandage, to affirm a transcendent creator beyond space and time as the best explanation for the origin of our finite universe. Second, fine-tuning. We live in what Australian physicist Luke Barnes calls an extremely fortunate universe, where fundamental laws and physical parameters have somehow been fine-tuned with just the right strengths and values to make life possible. The incredible odds against this happening by chance has led even agnostic and atheistic physicists to marvel. As British physicist Paul Davies has exclaimed, the impression of design is overwhelming. Atheist physicist George Greenstein expresses similar cognitive dissonance. The thought insistently arises that some supernatural agency must be involved. Third, the complexity of life. Molecular biology has revealed the presence in living cells of an exquisite world of informational nanotechnology, digital code in DNA and RNA, tiny, intricately constructed molecular machines, a complex information storage, transmission, and processing system that resembles but vastly exceeds our most advanced digital high technology. Not what anyone would expect to see as the result of blind, materialistic processes. Dawkins himself may have conceded as much when he recently confessed to being knocked sideways with wonder at the miniaturized intricacy of the data processing machinery in the living cell. So what should we make of all this? For their part, scientific atheists have constructed ever more convoluted and fanciful theories. They posit alien designers to account for the code of life, multiple parallel universes to try to explain fine-tuning, and they've developed elaborate mathematical equations in an attempt to use physics to show how the universe could have begun from nothing physical. But what if the scientific atheists are just wrong? What if the universe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is an intelligent and purposeful creator behind it all? In my book, Return of the God Hypothesis, I argue that the universe has precisely such properties. And that raises a hopeful possibility that we are not the product of blind, pitiless indifference, but instead that we were made on purpose, that we were intended. British historian Paul Johnson has argued that the existence or non-existence of God is the most important question we humans can ever ask. Given the scientific evidence we now have, it might be time to consider or reconsider this question. I'm Stephen Meyer, philosopher of science at the Discovery Institute for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To keep PragerU videos
Any more lengthy comments about that? I almost said any more significant comments, but that would be wrong because amen is a right comment, right? And it's not an insignificant comment. Yeah, you can kind of see too how presuppositionalism comes into some of this. So many scientists will just dismiss a lot of what was on that video because it involves God. And their presupposition is there is no God. So everything has to have a natural, what they would call a natural response. Okay? So their starting point doesn't allow them to look at the evidence and to find God in it. Because their starting point is there is no God. You see how that's a presupposition that they cannot prove? They just gratuitously assert this. There is no God. Therefore, even though the universe seems to be finely tuned and exhibits design, so that the human cell is an information library that would put the Library of Congress to shame, and even though all the books in the Library of Congress are there because there was an author or numerous authors who intelligently wrote those words out, well, God doesn't exist. That's our starting point. That's our presupposition. So even though we see this complexity, our starting point is there is no God. So we cannot acquiesce to what that complexity would seem to suggest to us, that there is a designer. Okay? Whereas the approach of Stephen Myers, I don't know what his apologetics approach is. He is a Christian, obviously. I don't know where he goes to church. I don't know if he's a Catholic Christian or an evangelical. I don't know who he is. I don't know a lot about him. But he's a good scientist. But his starting point is the God of the Bible exists, or at least he's a theist, right? There is a God. There's a powerful, transcendent God. And then he starts to, based on that presupposition, look at the evidence, the science, if you will, and from his starting point, that science leads him, it actually, I think, affirms his presupposition. Okay?
You know, if you submit to the idea of a lawgiver, you know, moral law and natural law, you know, it's interesting that, you know, the scientist, you know, spends his career studying the natural law, you know, and
Yes.
and would admit that there are laws, be it gravity or whatever, you know, that they submit to, or that, you know, they see it work, they see it at work, and then he can prove in many ways that these exist, you know, and so we submit to those as laws. And but you know, so in that sense, it's like it's a worship of the creation rather than the creator. You know, for the atheist, the one who denies the lawgiver, because they will submit to the laws that they observe.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a denial of that law too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It seems interesting that of all those people that he was throwing up there, you know, they all have significant status in the science, you know, world. They're doing the frontline research and discovery. So you sort of have the people that don't believe in God finding things that prove that God, or that there was a creator, however they want to define it. You know, 100 years ago, the two sides probably were closer together in the sense that it was harder for each side to prove their position. And yet as we come through, the more discoveries we make, it's the side that says there is no God who is actually bolstering our side and confusing them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so by way of summarizing, because I think we're at a logical starting point, so I think we'll stop here a little bit early today. But by way of summary, what I'm trying to throw out is that oftentimes what we end up believing, here's a way of stating it: which position answers the most questions with the fewest difficulties? Okay? And today we're saying theism or atheism. So which one of those positions answers the most questions for actually living life? I mean, for actually doing life. Which one of those answers the most questions while giving us the fewest difficulties? And in my mind, it's not even close. That theism, the belief in God, the belief in the God of the Bible, answers the most questions and has fewer difficulties than its alternative. Okay, for all the reasons that we've looked at today, and we'll come back to this next week, we're going to look at Aristotle's 6 causes, which might seem rather abstract, but there's a point in that I think is pretty significant. Then we're also going to look at the universal knowledge of God, and we'll really get into the Bible. The one thing that bothers me about today is that we did not open our Bibles, okay? And I want to try to avoid that, you know. So next week we will get into our Bibles, particularly with this universal knowledge of God. The Bible asserts that we all know that God exists, okay? And so we'll look at that, okay? Yeah, David.
The Bible actually admits a bias. It says, we talked about last week, that in the beginning God, it wasn't arguing for God. The Bible admits a bias toward God. The scientists who say they're unbiased are actually biased away from God. And so it's really, at one level, admitting a bias. I'm going to, everything I see, I'm going to bias toward God. And just naturally, I'm going to assume that God is the creator. That's what I believe. My evidence will, what I
Yeah, and you hear that in statements like, well, we follow the science and you're people of faith. You know, we're clear-headed thinkers, we're not biased, we just follow the facts and you just follow your faith. That is so untrue. And from a biblical perspective, I mean, you really see that where people are suppressing the knowledge of God. Because they don't want to deal with, if there's a God, then the consequences of that are profound, you know, if you reject God. And so rather than dealing with that, they just ignore it. Okay, well, we'll pick this up next Sunday. But I need someone